I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Dan Fleming this afternoon. He's going to break open that idea of pilgrimage for us a bit this afternoon. So I'd please put your hands together for Dr. Dan Fleming.
Nice to be with you, folks. I see a few familiar faces in the room. I am here because of World Youth Day in 2002, and it led me on a remarkable journey of faith, challenge, insight, surprise, to where I am now. So I might say a little bit about what I do now and why I'm here today with you, and then I've got something prepared this afternoon which I hope will be a little bit refreshing for you, and a time for reflection for you. I know you've had a busy day. I'll look through your agenda. You've had a lot of content. You've had a lot of things to think about and worry about for this great adventure you're embarking on. So hopefully this is a time of restoration and reflection for you. I work for St Vincent's Health Australia, and I'm what's called their group manager for ethics and formation. How many people have heard of St Vincent's hospitals before? So we're a national group. We have 31 facilities across the country and 18,500 staff. Every day people are born in our facilities, they die in our facilities, we touch homeless people, we heal those people who many other people would not want to go near. And in some ways our ministry reflects what Christ talked about when he invited people into a pilgrimage out of their comfort zones to encounter people who are vulnerable, to heal the sick, to let the blind see and so on. And before that I worked at, has anybody heard of a place called BBI before, the Broken Bay Institute, or the Australian Institute of Theological Education? I was their academic dean for a few years and ran some of their courses too, so some of our old friends and stakeholders are in the room. So I'm an academic by trade, but I'm only an academic because of the experience that I had at World Youth Day, which opened my eyes to something that I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. The pilgrimage was a vehicle for me to experience a loving God, a surprising God. And that's what I want to try and reflect on this afternoon with you for a while. When I was lecturing, we call this the graveyard shift because everybody looks like they're about to die. I know where our palliative care ward is and I know the head doctor there, so if anybody is on the edge, I can take you up there and make sure it's very nice for you. But we're going to start in a reflective mode, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of content, but mostly reflection. Time to think about why are you doing what you're doing in leading people on a pilgrimage journey, and what on earth is it all about? So I'd invite you just to pause for a moment, and as long as you can prevent yourself from falling asleep, you might like to shut your eyes. If you're going to fall asleep, just stare at a neutral point in front of you. And we'll just spend a few moments centering ourselves and becoming aware of the presence of God in this room. A very ancient and popular now way of doing that is to turn our attention to our breath which is always there, seldom recognised, but always there, just as God is always there. And I invite you to breathe in deeply, hold it for a moment, and breathe out. Breathe in deeply, hold it for a moment, and breathe out. Breathe in deeply, hold it for a moment, and breathe out. And in that very rare silence, that silence that we don't experience very much in our 21st century, I invite you to become aware of the presence of God in this room. The God who, as some writers say, is closer to us than we are to ourselves. God who's in every person around you. The God who's inviting you and those special people you'll be taking with you in 2019 into closer relationship. And just spend a little moment now resting in that God. As you're sitting in that quiet, I'd like you to reflect on or remember a time when you were surprised in a radical way. And when I say radical, I mean the root of that word comes from root-like, a way that changed the way you saw everything. It might have been to do with faith, it might have been to do with a relationship, it might have been a discovery that you had academically. A time that you were profoundly surprised. And just sit with that memory for a moment. Then think about what the features of that experience were. How would you describe it if you were going to describe it to someone? What happened in you when you encountered that surprise? And then gently now, when you're ready, come back to the room. And if you're comfortable doing so, just have a natter with the people around you. If you don't want to share your example of the surprise you encountered, you might like to just share some of the features of it. What's it like to be surprised? What does it feel like? What happens in you? We'll come back together as a group after that. Now, what time do you need it from you? You need me to... Cool. That's good. Okay, let's come back as a group. And what I'd love to hear, I'm going to go around the room now because I don't know many of you in this room, and I'd love to hear a little bit about you. And either your example of surprise or some feature of what it's like. What does it feel like to be surprised? We might start at the back of the room with the guys in ties because you're very serious up there. I think we need to hear from you first. And what we'll do is we'll come around this way to your right, my left. So Chris Cotter, you'll be next, and then we'll move down and then do a little horseshoe. So I'd love to hear your name, where you're from, and yeah, something about surprise. Just keep it, yeah.
From Sydney.
Yep.
And Mark from Parramatta. I guess I'll just share his point of view as well. Mark was speaking about his surprise as a teacher and dealing with so many personalities. Going into a classroom or seeing students on the playground. I mean, you have a certain perception once you see the person, but then it could be a totally different. It could be a surprise, as to what the person really is or who the person really is.
Or just the uniqueness of 1,000 kids in your school.
Yeah.
Just continual daily surprises when you interact with them.
Right, which sometimes is pleasant and sometimes not so pleasant, right? Who hasn't led a pilgrimage here before? some people. Be ready for both sides, okay? The pleasant and not so pleasant. I should say too, two of my colleagues are here who I've led a group to World Youth Day in 2005 with Kelly and Father George. So thanks you guys. What about we pop over to Chris and your team over there?
I was just sharing with my table.
What's your name first?
Oh, sorry. I'm Charlie Wilson from the Wollongong Diocese. My sister's just recently given birth to a little boy, and I was just recalling the moment when she told me that she was pregnant.
Yeah.
So that surprise and excitement. But I couldn't actually put the moment into words. It was just
Yeah.
so surreal.
Kind of overcomes you, doesn't it? And yours and her life would have been changed from that point in time. Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. Who's sitting next to you, hiding behind you there?
I'm Haiti. I'm from Wagga as well. I couldn't pinpoint one moment because life is full of surprises and I didn't have enough time to think of just one. So everything was just racing through my head. So a bit overwhelmed with it all, really.
Good. Surprises are overwhelmed. Thanks, Haiti.
Sorry.
Chris, what do you reckon?
Chris from Wagga. Energy, increase in energy for life.
Yep.
Yeah. So positive energy.
That's what happens to you when you encounter
that's
surprise. Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris.
I'm Nathan, I'm from Wagga as well. I was really going to piggyback off Charlotte because I was thinking about the other side of what the previous announcement, but my wife actually having a child, but that was actually fear that I got from that.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
Absolutely.
So, 7 years.
And you went again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll work out what happened one day, but so I still get that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, just being a parent and that surprises every day that turn up.
He's the person I'm responsible for.
Yeah, allegedly, yeah.
Very good. Thanks.
I'm Lauren from Wollongong Diocese as well. I suppose when in the moment of surprise, it's that whole body experience. It's almost like all of your senses are alive and how do you react to that?
You kind of become present, don't you?
Yeah,
You can't get out of the moment.
hyper
Yeah.
present. Yeah.
For good or bad, because if it's a nasty surprise, as sometimes it is, you can't get out of the whatever's going on, but if it's a beautiful surprise. What about down here?
I'm Father Greg. Originally I'm from Poland, but I work here in Sydney. I'm Salvatorian as Father George. And I recall to my mind one situation when, after my ordination, my provincial told me that I'm going to Australia to work here, and I was shaking, I was so excited and nervous because I didn't speak in English,
Yeah.
and all was new for me, and I think it was a huge shock for me.
Yeah. Thanks. Great example. Father George.
Love is full of surprises for me, and it's like every day is a surprise. Same with like a colleague from behind, that when you said that, there were so many events coming to my head, and some of them were, good, some were bad, but I think I wanted to sort of say, oh my God. And that's what I wanted to say, So it was that surprise, but in a positive way, or sometimes not so positive.
Anita from Perth. I think your star reflection took me back to my first World Youth Day as well, and World Youth Days are always full of surprises, no matter how many you go to. But I think the sense of wonder and awe when you see those big crowds, the flags, the joy of the church alive, and what the universal church looks like. That was my thought of surprises.
Thank you.
Hello, Catherine from Catholic Church Insurance. This is not profound or meaningful in any way, but when my niece was born and I was sitting there with my sister-in-law and my brother, they said to me, so her middle name is Catherine. I said, oh, what? What? Catherine with a K? And they go, yeah. Oh, what? It's got the same as me. Yeah. I said, oh. have you named her after me? And I said, yes. So that was a big moment of surprise for me, but it took me a few seconds to understand that. So
that's a
delayed
great
reaction.
observation. And I do think it's profound, actually. That's very beautiful. Thanks, Kath.
I was kind of at first like you mentioned about like lots of things went through my mind, but then it kind of really quickly zoomed in, which was unusual, and it zoomed into the moment that, and it was a moment of hyper awareness when my husband and I kind of, this moment when we realised, okay, that's it, like, we're stuck together forever now. Like, but this immense love and just certainty that that's what was meant to be. So, yeah, and it was just this, hyper awareness of, and surprise, I guess.
Great, Gabrielle.
Fiona from Broken Bay, and I think babies create a lot of surprise. So I'm going to sound a bit repetitious here, but probably the biggest impact is, even though you have 9 months or more of being pregnant, I just remember looking at this humidity crib of my first baby, and I've got a photo of me looking at her, and just in awe, like you can't quite figure out, like I know I was pregnant, but really? And where did she come from? And just sort of speechless, and I know, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. So probably that's why it's a big surprise. But yeah, for me, that's the biggest surprise. I guess just trying to make sense of the fact that this life came from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Fiona.
Kelly from Broken Bay. Couldn't help but think of my first World Youth Day experience with Dr. Dan. And how profound that was for me. A particular moment that involved both Dan and George, and I remember everything of that moment. I remember what the sun felt like, I remember what it smelled like, I remember the sounds, that hypersensitivity of it. I can recollect, even 15 years later now, I can replay every moment of that afternoon at the edge of Lake George. So it's very
Growing.
Thanks, Kev.
Michael from Sydney. A few things I've sort of been reflecting on, but one of the things is about surprise being overwhelming, but also sometimes when it's shared encounters of surprise. So just think about World Youth Day experience with students when they're sort of, they're in that massive crowd and their eyes are sort of, deer in the headlights sort of thing. But then sometimes when they'll see you for a moment and then all of a sudden they change because they see that reassurance. Even with kids as well, like having your own children, the privilege that comes with sharing an encounter or surprise with someone else and journeying through that with them, and at that moment becomes, I guess, a shared moment. But when you've got responsibility for someone in that, or you're helping through that, it becomes a real moment of privilege to share with that person.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you for that. What about next table? Who's going to go first?
That I was really surprised was when I went on a school trip to Europe at the age of 16. Parents were freaking out. I was freaking out. And then when I was there, I realized I can do it. So it's just to really trust and be confident in yourself. And I think that's where I understand how it's been as well. So just trust and just understand that it will be okay if you have to stay positive and
So there's a self-surprise, a surprise of your own capability.
yeah, just jazz myself a bit, but no, I'm more than capable.
Excellent. Who wants to go next?
I'm Chloe from Cosmos. I was very surprised when my best friend told me she was engaged because she hadn't been engaged with a guy for very long. So it was a lot of emotions. I was so happy for her that she's met the guy in her dreams, but then I was concerned, is she rushing into it, is she being pressured? So I didn't really know how to react. But once she reassured me that no, it's all good, and she, once this, so I was very happy for her. But yeah, a lot of emotions and very surprised.
I'm Veronica from Cosmos. I took it really literal the surprise thing, and I picked my surprise birthday party.
That's great.
It was really nice that they threw me a party, so I was like, yay!
Was it genuinely surprised? Like you didn't know?
Yeah, I had no idea
Wow.
because I really wasn't dressed for the occasion. And I just got back from Fiji that day, and I had like my hair braided, and I looked really cool. Just thought we're having a nice quiet night in. Oh, there's a house full of people. It's pretty good.
Great.
Elise from Cosmos. Bad surprise when I was told that I was being made redundant from my last job, which was very hard to take. So I think there was definitely a fear that was set in, but I knew that it was time. I had to do this. I couldn't, stay put. I had to move on. I had to have the confidence to move on and know that I could get a new job. And here I am. So it wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be.
Russell from Cosmos. I suppose surprises for me is always seeing how people around me react to things that's going on, especially things that I'm involved in when they're part of that team, and how they react. Not just to these guys here, but the team in Lagana, how they rise and pole, and how they reacted to 2,500 kilometres rocking up at age gate. It was a surprise to see how somebody had reacted to that.
Thanks, Ross. I'm glad I knew Cosmos was a travel agency before I came here. Because otherwise it would have been like, we're from Broken Bay, we're from Wagga Wagga, and I would have thought you were from another planet.
We just dived in and just dived back out again. A nightmare for the rest of people, but
I know Lee Burden's gone over. He's definitely from another planet.
We're next door to the least.
What about back there?
Thomas from Hobart. Sometimes people think that's not Make sure it was not. I had a very similar experience at one of the working days at my beach as well. I was at a catechesis session, and I was surprised that what I was hearing there really touched me deep in my heart and completely immersed in the experience of the Holy Spirit, where I really wanted to have a find for this faith based on something I had never heard before. That really pierced me, and I was surprised, and again a lot of emotion and just almost overwhelming feeling at that moment.
Great, thank you.
I'm Steph from Brisbane. My surprise is also based on my first boarding day experience, and seeing Steve Angrosano do what he does so well, and realising that there was a whole new call to my life that I didn't even knew existed, and felt a whole new fire within me, and that joy and sense of purpose and sense of who I am. I think things have felt like they felt a place, and that I figured out who I was and what I was meant to do, and that was really cool.
Thanks, Steph.
I'm Leanne from Melbourne. The moment I focused on was the first time I had a significant conversation with my now fiancé, and just the sense of kind of wonder about who this person is, and that's kind of a general response is to surprise, with that sense of wonder, like how can this be, and also gratitude, like thankfulness to God. So yeah, wonder and gratitude.
I'm very conscious we haven't heard from you, and I know you're filming, and when you're a crew, you feel like you're example. Do you have an example? No. What are some words that you heard, some common words you heard during those reflections from people? Or if you're asked to synthesize, some verbs, things you heard just then, what are some of the key words that kept coming up? Or, yeah. Surprise.
Unknown.
Yeah, unknown, yeah, absolutely. I heard wonder and awe quite a few times. Yeah. What else?
Being overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed, yeah. Someone said gratitude.
Emotional.
Yeah, emotional. All of these things are characteristic of surprise. And what kind of reflecting on a phenomenon like that tells us just about our humanness, it's not a particularly profound observation, is that we don't know everything. Life still surprises us. Everything still surprises us, but often we still act like we know everything. We act like we're kind of got it all under control all of the time, but nonetheless something will happen which profoundly changes everything for us. And when we reflect on our faith tradition, the faith tradition that's given birth to this wonderful event called World Youth Day, it's a tradition full of surprises as well, and it has at its heart a surprising God. A God who, when you look all the way back into the beginnings of the scriptures, to some of the first written materials about the story of the Exodus and so on, you kind of come face to face with a God who doesn't do what people expect. A God who invites people out of slavery into freedom, and does so in ways that the very people he invites challenge the invitation because they don't think it can happen. Say, God, that can't work. What does Moses say? I can't even speak. Why are you choosing me to do this? The great founder of the three, what we call Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, Abraham, is challenged to leave his home, and he never ever returns. And that's almost the paradigm story for our whole faith tradition, that people leave comfort and enter into what is surprising and new and never ever return. Now, anyone who reflects deeply on their lives know that we're doing this all the time, unless we're kind of kidding ourselves. As we've just heard, there's these kind of poignant moments in life that invite us outside of our comfort zone, and after them, we don't see the world again the same way. Even those of you who said it wasn't particularly profound, even though I think they were, after the surprise party, life wasn't the same again, right? You knew that you had friends who were willing to keep a secret from you, but also do something beautiful for you, which changes the way you see the relationship. You know that your brother-in-law and sister cherish you so much that they're willing to name a child after you. It's profound. We believe in a surprising God, and sometimes we forget that. And pilgrimage is an invitation for those who take the journey to encounter that God in a new way, perhaps for the first time. Pilgrimage, of course, is bigger than World Youth Day. Pilgrimage is an ancient phenomenon where people pick up their stuff and usually used to walk. They didn't catch planes, of course. But it wasn't for the journey itself. It wasn't to do with where their destination was physically. It was to encounter this surprising God in new and different ways. And apropos of that, you don't need to leave Australia to go on pilgrimage. But there's something about leaving one's geographic home, getting totally outside of one's comfort zone, that opens the mind and heart to new kinds of experiences. And in a sense, that's what I think happened to me and the people who I've spoken to. And I know Richard, who works with Anthony very well on all of the research. The enduring effects that people have when they experience World Youth Day at its best combine these elements, taken away from comfort into somewhere foreign and unknown. The mind is all of a sudden able to integrate new stuff. I'm having new experiences, meeting new people. But underlying all that, the richness of the experience is, ultimately I meet a God who I didn't know before in the way that I know now. Let me give you an example of that which I came across just 2 days ago. I've been so privileged the last 2 days. Our organisation, especially here in Sydney, but also in Melbourne, the public hospitals, care a lot for people with profound drug addictions. And we're currently in a process of thinking about what more we can do to help these people who are overdosing on the streets often and all of this kind of thing, especially in Melbourne, less so in Sydney now. I've met 4 people this week, one who's been clean from heroin for 20 years, 3 who are still on it and are kind of on their way, and some will never get off it and so on. And I've had the chance to listen deeply to their stories. And the first guy, whose name I won't mention, but he shared a beautiful story about beautiful but troubling story about his surprise encounter with the loving God who we're kind of referring to when we talk about this pilgrimage journey. He started life in a small town outside Wagga Wagga, actually, and had a very difficult childhood. He was a gay man. He got picked on in what was then a very small and inwardly focused country town. He eventually decided he had to get out of there because his mother died. He thought she was the only person on the planet who loved him. He hated his dad and his dad hated him, so he left and he hopped on the train. He thought, where can I go where I'll be accepted? And he ended up in King's Cross up here. And to cut his long and very difficult story short, he ended up addicted to heroin, engaging in prostitution to make money, and ended up contracting HIV/AIDS. He was given a death sentence. He was told he had 6 months to live, and he actually ended up in our palliative care ward up there in Sydney. And someone came to him and would have been a pastoral carer or something at St Vincent's, and just started sitting with him and reading the gospel stories with him. And his surprise was meeting a Christ who was loving. This was a guy who was 26, 27 years old, who'd never heard of a Christ who was loving. Imagine how that would have changed his life earlier. But nonetheless, it transformed everything. So now he volunteers at the hospital. He runs a whole bunch of different experiences out of a church near the hospital up there to try and give people a sense of what it's like to live on the street. He lived on the street for about 20 years. He's got no teeth left. Heroin does that to you after a while. It kind of eats away at the calcium in your mouth and creates cavities and things like that. He was one of the most beautiful people I've ever met, and had a real comfort with God, which often you don't see with people, even those of us who have been kicking around the church for many years. As street people often do. When he was telling his story in the middle of a church in the middle of the city, it was, peppered with F-bombs and all sorts of other things, and he'd continually, every time he swore, turn around and apologise to Jesus, who I'm sure didn't mind. That's a story of a surprising God. Who knows what his image of God was beforehand, but it was wrong according to the Christian tradition. Whatever he was operating out of was a wrong idea of God. And then all of a sudden, somebody introduced him to a true idea of God, and it changed his life entirely. Hasn't been perfect since, but as a very gradual journey, he's kind of come to a point at which he's totally comfortable in his own skin. And totally comfortable with his past history and sins and all that kind of thing too. I'm going to give you a little handout now, and what I've done here, and I thank especially my colleague Peter Mudge from BBI, and you might say a prayer for Peter, who's going through a difficult time at the moment, as you get this. Father George and I wrote an article which is available on the World Youth Day website called Leaving Home, Reflections on Pilgrimage. One of the surprises I thought of when we were doing Surprise was that 2 days after I started my new job, the first person to give me a task was actually Father George, saying, Dan, we've got to write an article together about this. What I've done here is kind of gather together some reflections which are built on that article. So we're not going to go through the article, which is academic in a sense, but it reflects on our tradition and how our tradition speaks about the faith journey as a constant journey of leaving home. But what I've gathered to here, thanks a lot to some of the research Peter's been doing on Pope Francis, are some reflections on faith and leaving home. And it's only right at the end that I'll draw this back into a kind of synthesis about what it means to talk about pilgrimage. Because what I'll say at the end, and it's always good to tell people where you're going before you start, is that pilgrimage is a means to an end. It's a means to the end of helping people encounter that loving God. If it becomes an end in itself, then it's probably not. It's probably a holiday or something like that. But when it's a means to an end of giving people an experience of that loving God, then we're really on pilgrimage. So I'm going to do this just reflectively, a little bit like a Lectio Divina, if you've experienced that form of prayer before. We'll enter back into that silence that we had before, and I'm going to read these quotes, which are taken from different parts of Pope Francis's journey, including before he was Pope, when he was then known as Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio. And as we go, I'll just give you a few little ideas to build up a vision of this leaving home. And when I say leaving home, I'm not just talking about going outside of our physical home and shutting the door and going overseas. I'm talking about leaving our spiritual home, leaving behind our idea of whatever God is and who we are. Some of your stories beautifully illustrated this, to encounter something quite new, to encounter the surprising God. So we've already done points 1 and 2 there. So point number 3, and let's just enter back into this quiet space. And if you want to shut your eyes, you can shut your eyes. If you want to just look at the words on the page, feel free to do that. I'll read this slowly. This was written by Cardinal Bergoglio, then before he was Pope. Little by little, increasing security has made us bolt doors, employ means of vigilance, install security cameras, and mistrust strangers who call at our door. The closed door is really a symbol of today. It's something more than a simple sociological fact. It's an existential, and by that he means a truly human reality that's imposing itself as a way of life, a way of confronting reality, others, and the future. The closed door is really a symbol of our today. So just a few little questions for you to reflect on in your own heart, and you don't need to, we won't share these answers, we'll have a group discussion at the end and can share what we feel comfortable with. What do you think it does for a surprising God when the closed door is the symbol of our today? What would it do to God if we approached the pilgrimage with a closed door mentality? That we'll control what goes on, that we'll define all of the experiences our people will have. What do you think it does to a faith community when it runs out of a disposition of closed doors, closed to God and closed to others? What do you close doors on? What surprises are you not willing to let in? If you've been following the readings for this week, you might have noticed Jonah in the last couple of days, who absolutely hates the surprise he's given by God when he's asked to go and talk to the people of Nineveh and tell them that they should repent. And when they do, he absolutely hates that too, and he hates the fact that God accepts their repentance. What ideas of God aren't you willing to let in? We all have them. So here then Cardinal Bergoglio is reflecting on something which is common to our tradition, and that's the observation that God normally interrupts our smooth way of thinking about him, our way of living, our perceptions of reality, and challenges us beyond them. And when we lock ourselves away, we also leave that God outside the doors. So we're challenged to move beyond where we currently are. And this is where the next quote comes in. This is actually an address to a group of Jesuits. So he mentions Jesuits, but when you hear, I'm just going to change Jesuits to pilgrimage leaders in the hope that that's with the spirit of what he's saying. So point 4 I've called a holy and beautiful restlessness. The heart of Christ is the heart of a God who out of love emptied himself. Can't empty yourself through a locked door. Each one of us, as pilgrimage leaders who follow Jesus, should be ready to empty him or herself. We are called to this humility, to be emptied beings, not to hold on to things, not to lock things in, to be men and women who are not centered on themselves, because the center of the society, or the center of our pilgrimages, is Christ and his church. And God is the Deus semper mea, the God who always surprises us. And if the God of surprises is not at the centre, our pilgrimage becomes disorientated. Because of this, to be a pilgrimage leader means to be a person of incomplete thought, of open thought. Because he or she thinks always looking to the horizon, which is the ever greater glory of God, who ceaselessly surprises us. And this is the restlessness of our inner abyss, this holy and beautiful restlessness. Thinking back to those surprises that you mentioned before and some of the reflections around the group, I note how the words gratitude came out and how reflections about how they drew people beyond where they were before into surprising, into what's unexpected. They changed the way we saw the world. Not of our own efforts. In each case, it's very hard to surprise yourself. And when we reflect on that and we reflect on the surprising God, we become restless with what we currently know, what we currently appreciate, what we currently relate to in God, and we seek after more. Just sit with that for a little bit. This holy and beautiful restlessness. Pilgrimage is about stepping out of home, whatever our comfortable home is, and into God and whatever that means for our future. It's profoundly countercultural in the sense of our Australian context, where we tell people that they should have a life plan. Stepping out of home means kind of stepping away from that and into what God's asking. So here the Pope says this: the symbolic management of doors, of thresholds, of passages, of borders has become crucial. He's referring back to his earlier work there. The door must protect, of course, but not reject. The door must not be forced, but on the contrary, one asks permission, because hospitality shines in the freedom of welcoming and dims in the arrogance of invasion. The door is frequently opened in order to see if there is someone waiting outside, perhaps without the courage or perhaps without the strength to knock. This is a reflection on what the surprising God asks of us as pilgrimage leaders and leaders in the church. Do we demonstrate what hospitality is in the context of our pilgrimage? When our pilgrims come on our pilgrimage journey, do they experience the freedom of welcoming? Do we open our doors to see if there's someone waiting outside? Perhaps without the courage or the strength to knock. And those of you who have led pilgrimages before, I'm sure, can think of examples of the little people who come along with you, the vulnerable ones, who, even though we love our church and we're proud of it, we know that it, like any other social organisation, does tend to exclude the little ones from time to time. And a pilgrimage journey is no different to that. So how do we as leaders challenge that mentality? How do we ensure that we open the door of the pilgrimage so that all have a place? And this leads to something quite radical, I think, about the surprising God. And this is the last little reflection there. And I'm just going to I'll read it first and then just give you a little story about the other 3 people I met this week and how that surprised me. Number 6 is, who do we encounter when we encounter God? Francis says this: Jesus' disgraced body is stripped, yet the Spirit comes to aid us amidst our dismay and bewilderment. He teaches us to understand God's language, the language of kenosis, which is a Greek word which means self-emptying, the abasement that leads God to come to us wherever we find ourselves. The Orthodox theologian Christos Yannaris tells us this language that God speaks, the language of kenosis, the child Jesus lying naked in the manger, naked in the river as he receives baptism like a slave, hanging on the tree of the cross, naked like a common criminal. In all this he showed his love for us. Sometimes when we spend all of our time in church thinking and Christian thinking and so on, you forget how strange it is and surprising it is that our image of God is the child Jesus lying naked in the manger, naked in the river as he receives baptism, like a slave, hanging on the tree of a cross, naked like a common criminal. One of the, I suppose, more recent surprises that I've had to encounter in my faith journey was just yesterday. Sitting in a room with a whole bunch of executives and clinicians and others from St Vincent's Health Australia, and hearing the story of 3 heroin addicts, and recognising halfway through their talk, it took me, it was a 20-minute talk, I guess. Well, in fact, no, it probably went for 45 minutes. The great thing about working with people with addictions is you can't contain them. So we had our very, rigorous agenda there with everything perfectly timed. Of course, they took triple the time they were supposed to. But anyway, halfway through their speaking, I sat there and I realised, the Christian gospel tells us that these people are the image and likeness of God. And more radically still, that because of their vulnerability, the way they see the world has a priority in any of our thinking. And because of their vulnerability, they are Christ. You can't get away from that when you read the 25th chapter of Matthew. I was sitting in the room with 3 images of God, 3 Christs, hearing their story, and that's incredibly surprising. So what surprises are you setting up in your pilgrimage journey for people to look into the face of Christ, and not the face of the sanitized Christ who's clean, who doesn't stink, who doesn't challenge, who makes us feel very comfortable with our kind of wealthy way of living in Australia, but the Christ who's dirty, the Christ who has no teeth left, the Christ who calls to us and knocks at our door and challenges us to open. If we don't come from a perspective in the faith journey of leaving home, we'll never hear that Christ. You see that in the parable of Lazarus at the gate in the Gospel of Luke. We're too occupied with making everything nice inside that we don't hear the voice outside. So how can pilgrimage be an experience of encountering the face of Christ? So let's just take a moment of quiet now and just reflect on pilgrimage as leaving home. How you will very literally be taking people away from their homes and away from their comfort zones, hopefully not just for the purpose of giving them a good time, although I'm sure you're going to do that too. Hopefully not just the purpose for seeing sights, although I'm sure you're going to do that too. Hopefully not just for the purpose of building great relationships with each other, although I'm sure you're going to do that too. But with the ultimate purpose of doing all of these things precisely so that these people, like my friend who I met on Tuesday, meet a surprising God. A God who loves them deeply, wants them to flourish, But we'll also ask them, as he asks us, to listen for his crying voice in those who are poor and vulnerable. I'm known for being compulsively on time. I used to deliver lectures in Chris's diocese, and he'll testify that. We have 1 minute. Are there any final reflections or anything you'd like to share? Any questions? I encourage you to read that article. I think it's pretty good. It's not too long, and it kind of articulates some of the theory behind this and why this kind of vision of inviting people into the surprising God is part and parcel of our great faith tradition, which you're inviting people to enter into. So, thank you.